My name is Mark Lutter. I'm the founder and executive director of the Center for Innovative Governance Research. We're a relatively new organization. I started full-time on this about 10 months ago, and we had our sort of formal public-facing launch about 6 months ago. And I'm having the time of my life, and so it means the world to me that you will all take time out of your days to come and to participate in this event. I really appreciate that. The goal with my talk is to draw, I think, together a lot of these themes that we've already been discussing. And I think we're in the early stages of a global revolution in governance. The post-war governing consensus, which was first dominated by the US and the Soviet Union, and now the US has dominated, is very rapidly changing. America is pulling back from the world stage. The European project is facing its strongest challenge yet, migration. We see China increasingly confident and projecting both economic and now more recently military power abroad. Africa is changing very rapidly as well. They have their first tigers in Rwanda and Ethiopia. Combined with the demographic boom, we're seeing the potential for radical change. And with Russia basically playing the wild card and disrupting the status quo. And what I would like to suggest is that we are approaching a historical inflection point. These kinds of inflection points occur once every 2 or 3 generations. Typically, governance tends to be a little bit linear, right? The set of institutions which dominate at any given global inflection point then dominate for 2 or 3 generations with changes, but not particularly substantial changes. And today I want to argue that semi-autonomous municipalities, charter cities, provide a set of governing institutions that can best help humanity reach her potential, giving men, women, and their families the greatest opportunity for fulfillment and prosperity as we hit this global governing inflection point. So first, what is an inflection point? To start with what is not, the 1992 presidential election. What would it look like, what would the world look like today if George H.W. Bush had won instead of Bill Clinton? Probably pretty similar. China's economic expansion would have continued. U.S. economic trends would largely have been similar. One major change might be foreign policy. Perhaps a more restrained foreign policy of the Americans would be more credible if H.W. Bush had won, but perhaps not. It's hard to know. Long story short, if this was Back to the Future and H.W. Bush had gotten 4 more years, we wouldn't notice a big difference today. Biff Tannen is already president. And I just want to point out that joke was written by a Ted Cruz speechwriter. So, what does an inflection point look like? We can point to the Bolshevik Revolution. For example, the Germans basically let Lenin return to Russia. If the Germans had not let Lenin return to Russia, what would the world look like today? It's much more difficult to say. Perhaps there wouldn't have been the immediate turn to communism. Russia might have been spared some of these worst excesses, which might have sort of not lessened the impact of fascism, which at the time was a response to some of these horrors of communism. And so we might have avoided some of the political extremism that caused so much damage. There still would likely have been some political extremism, but perhaps not as bad. But again, this is difficult to say. So inflection points occur when the linear path of history breaks down and there is a high degree of uncertainty about the future. This allows for a much wider range of action and the ability to create something new. While we have not hit a global inflection point, we are approaching it. Economic, demographic, and migration trends are upending the post-war consensus, creating new opportunities. So why are we here today? Charter cities. Steve Wozniak pitched HP 5 times with his original design for the Apple I computer. HP still wasn't interested. It was easier for him to go his own direction and start a new company, which is obviously tremendously difficult, than it was to change the existing institution of HP to adopt what was a groundbreaking technology. And so I view charter cities as a political tool to allow for greater innovation in governance, to disrupt the status quo and to create something new when changing existing systems would otherwise be too hard. So typically, public choice stymies the improvement of governance, leading to stagnation. Charter cities, particularly built on greenfield sites, with no industry and with no population, present an end run around public choice problems, as there are no interest groups that have a direct cost to the creation of a charter city. And if properly engaged, in fact, it's possible to reverse the problem of collective action, as a real estate developer can act as a sponge to gain some of the benefits that the increased economic activity of a charter city produces, and therefore the real estate developer becomes incentivized to provide a lot of public goods that we traditionally associate as being provided by the state. So what is a charter city good for? It's good to change governance institutions. And I think this can be broadly split into two categories. One, to improve poor institutions. So we have a reasonably good idea of what successful governing institutions look like. Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark, the US. The challenge is effectively importing these systems, not really importing, obviously. There's a lot of qualifications that need to be done in creating them in other places. But as we've seen, the real only post-war success stories are mostly in the Southeast Asia region that have very long histories of statehood that they could draw on in creating these modern bureaucracies that are able to effectively execute a modern competent state. And so charter cities provide a solution. When you don't have that history of state capacity, how do you import successful institutions? And one way to do it, right, is a charter city with a blank slate where you can effectively, to a certain extent, export state capacity to an independent body that is able to provide those institutions that lay the groundwork for successful economic growth. The other avenue for charter cities is to push the frontier. And so, for example, just hearing about Dubai, right? Dubai is pushing the frontier in terms of governance. We can imagine a host of technologies that the US is not effectively developing because we have overly regulated, overly bureaucratized system. So for example, I believe right now the US has one what's the new genetic technology called? CRISPR. One active CRISPR trial, I believe they've actually started and not just gotten approval. I think China has like 7 or 8 going on. And this is in part because the FDA is very slow and risk averse in approving new technologies. So what would it look like if, for example, the FDA was valuing the consumer as much as it's valuing its reputation to not approve dangerous medicine? Which obviously is good, but the trade-off is that that medicine otherwise, if it's successful, takes longer to get to the people who need it most. On a more radical note, have any of you read Glenn Weil's new book, Radical Markets? So he proposes this idea called a Harburger tax, in which, okay, in the West, we have this tradition of freehold. And so a Harburger tax effectively says, okay, everybody places a value on their own property. Every year they have to pay taxes on that self-appraised value. That gives them an incentive to self-appraise that value very low. On the other hand, you must sell that property if somebody comes with an amount with the cash to buy at that level. And that incentivizes you to appraise the value high so people don't buy your value at a substandard value. And so the idea behind a Harburger tax is effectively to decrease transaction costs, to increase allocative efficiency so we can get assets to their highly valued use. Will it work? Probably not. But is it worth trying? Yes. And is this going to be tried in a liberal democracy? Probably not. So charter cities offer a venue to have these radical rethinking of property rights structures that could potentially lead to relatively high increases in efficiency. So moving on, Silicon Valley has previously dipped her toes into city building. What might have begun with the Seasteading Institute has spread to Google, also known as Sidewalk Labs, or Google, now Alphabet, which has a subsidiary called Sidewalk Labs. And yesterday I went to Tyler Cowen's, he did a live podcast with Eric Schmidt. And he asked Eric Schmidt about city building, and I thought Eric Schmidt's answer was interesting because he said not a lot of people are building new cities. And so I emailed Tyler and I was like, well, let me talk to him and I'll introduce him to a few people who are. And I think that's to a certain extent illustrative of my goal with this community is to build out the people who are doing this and to whom the rest of the world thinks they have knowledge, but in fact, I think there is a lot of knowledge in this room and yet to be tapped that can bring to bear on some of these real-world projects that might be a little bit misaligned in these early stages. We've also seen, for example, Y Combinator with their cities building program that morphed into a cities research program. And I've had multiple unicorn founders tell me I'm building up a war chest, so when I exit, I can go build a city. And I'm a big fan of these dreams, but I think it's important to understand the difficulty in building a charter city. It's not like a traditional startup. So sort of a traditional software startup, we can imagine putting 3 people in a room, locking the door, throwing away the key. 6 months, there's a minimum viable product. They can scale effectively because the marginal cost of additional users is very close to 0. But this obviously doesn't work with the city. So somewhat more analogous is a World of Atoms project like Boom, Tesla, WeWork, or SpaceX. And not even these projects accurately capture the complexity. So building a new city in its own right, without any legal autonomy, without any governance, is massively complex, and we'll hear Muya talk about his new city project later today. And so, in addition to the physical infrastructure, there are 2 other important parts of a charter city. 1 is politics, and 2 is governance. And so governance, assume the host country passes legislation that gives you a blank slate in governance. This means you have to create a governance system. What does that look like? You heard from Tom Bell earlier today, who offers ULEX as a way to relatively easily port a governance system. I mean, easily, right, in quotes, it's still really hard. You have the Dubai International Financial Center, for example, that did that, brought in a common law judge, but just for finance, and that model has since been replicated in one form or another in both Abu Dhabi as well as Qatar. But you need to do that not just for finance, also for labor, environmental, building, everything. And this is a complex system, so it's very difficult to understand the intricacies of the interaction of these rules, these regulations, until you really put it into practice. And what might be the hardest part is the politics. You need a government to say, okay, our laws, our regulations aren't working very well. We want you to come and improve them. And this is tricky to do, and we've seen it a few places, but mostly in relatively authoritarian states, which don't necessarily capture some of the political and civil liberties that at least I would like to live in, and I assume you are mostly sort of in somewhat agreement with. And so we've seen, at least in the last 10 years, a change in governance norms relating to local legal autonomy. For example, the Seasteading Institute, which Joe Quirk is somewhere in the audience, they were founded 10 years ago, and the idea was let's go to oceans because there's legal sovereignty there, there's legal autonomy there. And since they've adjusted their strategy and are now partnering with French Polynesia to create a sea zone in territorial waters, because I think it's become a little bit more apparent that countries are more willing to play with some of these ideas. For example, I did some consulting work on a project in Kazakhstan a little over 2 years ago where the government passed a secret law. I don't know what a secret law is, but I saw the law, and I guess, that had complete legal autonomy. They didn't really know what to do with it. It was a lot of urban planners who said, okay, we can build a financial center here, or we can build it here. We can have tall buildings, we can have medium-sized buildings. And I say what I thought was, I think most of you will agree with me, a somewhat obvious point. Well, it doesn't matter how tall the buildings are, where they are. If you don't have a legal system that's attractive to international finance, they're not going to want to do business here. And so distinguished professor of urban planning at MIT says, no, really? What does that even mean? So what I want to suggest is not only is this a way to do good in the world, it's also potentially a way to make a boatload of money. And another one of my goals is in creating this community is to move from some of the high-level theorizing about it to put this into practice. And so I mentioned this previously on the panel. Chicago, in the first 100 years of its existence, real estate prices increased 30,000-fold. That's not 30,000%, but 30,000-fold. The numbers are completely astounding. And if we think about governance as a market worldwide, governance accounts for about 30% of total GDP. So even capturing just a small fraction of this, the first $10 trillion company, it's probably not going to be Apple, it's probably not going to be Amazon, it's probably going to be some sort of real estate Shenzhen type city that can scale to that model. Interestingly enough, if you look at historically, the company with the largest ever market cap, inflation adjusted, is the Dutch East India Company that hit about $7.1 trillion at its peak. Building on some of these statistics, which Elaine's talk touched on, I think one of the important things is thinking not just in terms of governance, but also in terms of location, in terms of demographics. This estimate is now a few years old, but the UN, I think in 2014, estimated there's going to be another 2.5 billion urban residents by 2050. So this is approximately 70 million new urban residents every year, concentrated in Africa and Asia. Wade Shepard, he's a journalist who frequently reports on new city projects. I'd recommend you follow him. Estimates that there's over 200 master plan cities being built around the world. And this does not even include the organic city growth that happens naturally. So NEOM has been discussed. If you guys are interested in NEOM, go talk to Devin. Devin, say hi. She's writing an interesting paper on NEOM and has some relatively good access to high-level people. So it's to me, NEOM, while the execution might leave a little bit to be lacking, it really captures a lot of the high-level vision in terms of legal autonomy that is potential with some of these projects. I mentioned the new city project in Kazakhstan. Rendeavor, it's the largest urban property developer in Africa. They're building 7 new city or special economic zone projects in 5 countries. Egypt is moving its capital to a, as of yet, unnamed megacity. And China, the One Belt, One Road project has been discussed here as well, where they're to a certain extent exporting what has been their model for success, urbanization combined with special economic zones around the world. And it can be thought of a little bit as a Chinese version of the Marshall Plan, except they're investing an estimated $4 trillion with a T, so just mind-boggling sums of money. So the goal of the Center for Innovative Governance Research is to create the ecosystem within which charter cities can flourish. The new model requires the coordination between many different moving parts, and so far what I have seen is that a lot of these conversations have been a little bit siloed. So for example, Silicon Valley has been interested in city building, but talking to other people in Silicon Valley relatively frequently. Economists have been interested, development economists have been interested in charter cities, but for example, I was speaking to one of the leading experts in special economic zones. I mentioned seasteading, and he goes, "What's that?" And it's not like, right, seasteading was made fun of on the TV show Silicon Valley, so it's not unknown. And I consistently see this with different groups expressing surprise that there are other groups interested in some of these ideas. And so in building an ecosystem, what we've seen in the past, for example, with Paul Romer, he gives his TED Talk. He has an opportunity in Madagascar. He has another one in Honduras. Both of those don't go particularly well. And he gives up, and a lot of the excitement and chatter dies. Some of the techno-libertarian sort of sphere has been focusing on Honduras, and there hasn't been particularly much progress, though recently there's some sort of green shoots, so perhaps that will change. And I think it makes sense to adopt what might be a little bit more of a VC-style approach to put a lot of eggs in a lot of different baskets to maximize the opportunity so this space is not dependent on individual projects, but can have this knowledge sharing, can have this ideas that allow for the best potential of these ideas. And so the ecosystems are typically grow over time. And we can imagine, for example, if the current Silicon Valley ecosystem existed in 1970, we'd have more apples than exist today. But I think it makes sense to have a little bit of self-direction given the complexity of these tasks and given the fact that it might take 5 years, it might take a decade before a charter city, even if dirt is moving, even if legislation has passed, to really be seen as successful on the ground, just given the natural timescale of these projects. And so what does that community look like? I think it really begins with this room and with the type of people who are here today. So for example, I mentioned Silicon Valley with the entrepreneurial talent and potentially some of the seed funding. With the economists, well, I'm an economist, so I overemphasize them, but lawyers, technocrats, sort of the World Bank, urban planners, International Growth Center people who can bring a lot of credibility and technical expertise to the execution of these projects. The humanitarian community in Europe, with Michael working on refugee cities, is beginning to think about these ideas in a reasonably rigorous manner. You have the special economic zone community, especially Dubai, which fascinates me, that's beginning to think about how to export their special economic zone model. You have obviously politicians who are necessary to be included because they must pass the legislation, but let's be honest, they're lagging indicators. We have the real estate projects where if you're spending several billions of dollars on real estate, on infrastructure, you can spend a little bit, 20 million on improving governance, and that could vastly increase your returns to the real estate investment. And then lastly, there's finance, and so bringing together finance, potentially sovereign wealth funds, investment bankers, family offices that can really put some of the money behind these projects to see the value add in terms of, right, obviously a monetary return and hopefully the social return as well. So I view this as the beginning. This is one stage. This is a multi-year project. This is my life project. And I hope that it can be, if not, right, obviously I don't expect life projects for most people, but like if you're interested, come talk to me and let's figure out how to help. And so what this means is effectively scaling. And with the Center for Innovative Governance Research, we're basically developing two programs. One is events like this to begin to build the community where we can meet each other, where we can interact, where we can build these relationships that can pay off either in immediate partnerships or just down the road, this information sharing, this mental model to lower the transaction costs between different groups. And so I like to joke, one of my comparative advantages is I speak multiple languages. I come from a distinguished line of bureaucrats, so I speak bureaucrat. I'm an economist, so I speak economics. I can speak Silicon Valley. I'm learning real estate, and I'm sort of, right, like pretending to know finance. But having these shared mental models lowers the transaction costs among these different groups, so they're able to communicate more effectively, have that mutual learning, and be able to execute better on the ground. The other aspect is research. And so this is a more of a traditional think tank aspect. I wanted, if you know economist Lant Pritchett, he's a Harvard Kennedy School, I believe, and also the Center for Global Development. He tells a story where he was in Pakistan, and the governor of a Pakistani state says, Lant, you do economics, you're a world-renowned economist, and you do development economics. What should I spend my money on? Right? We have these incoming revenues, and we want to spend it to develop this Pakistani state. What do I do? And Lant's answer was, I don't know. Because the economics research has basically shied away from some of these very specific questions of optimizing for, right, like state spending. This is to say economics should only research that, but if there are real-world applications, it seems like economics is a field that has useful things to say that might want to inform them. And so, I'm very sorry. So there's this sense of practical research that hopefully can inform decisions on the ground. And some interesting questions, for example, are what is the impact of changes in the World Bank Doing Business Index on urban land values? If there can, it's very difficult to get urban land value data on that, but if you even some preliminary research, for example, might be able to show these new city projects, these mega real estate developments, the clear value add of considering adding governance. We can also think looking at the Dubai International Financial Center, Abu Dhabi Global Market, Qatar Financial Authority. Both of these are a little bit different. What were the decision trees that they had? What were the trade-offs they faced in choosing how to implement common law? And what can be learned from them now that they've been operating Dubai for 15 years, the others only for like 2 years, but what can be learned for those decisions that were made, and how can that be used for future projects? The other type of research is foundational, looking at what is the base economic case for charter cities, what is the base philosophical case, what is the base legal case, to really get a solid foundation for these ideas such that when the future comes, when there's different incentive structures, when things change, there is this solid foundation to hold on to not just be subject to whatever is fashionable at the moment. And so the goal for the Center for Innovative Governance Research is basically to become the Schelling point for interest in charter cities, to bring people together to build this community that it will hopefully be able to execute these projects on the ground. So when countries are considering charter cities who want experts to testify, they bring our experts. When companies want to implement charter cities and want people to help draft legislation or governance norms or et cetera, they reach out to our experts. And again, this is in the very early stages, so this is the big vision. But if you are interested in helping, come talk to me. Let's figure out what your capability is, what you want to do, and let's place you in the most highly valued place to build this and help have a massive impact on the world, because I truly believe that this can help lift tens of millions of people out of poverty and really change the world for the better. So thank you.